Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. In today's episode, Bill's going to be talking about the primary and secondary nutrients, and without further ado, I'll let him explain.
So now at this part of the soil test that we've went down piece by piece and nutrient by nutrient to try to get that amount of pounds, the balance between percentages and pounds, but we're talking about all of the primary nutrients, and we'll talk more about nitrogen. We talked about what's stored there, but we'll talk a little bit about that before I close today. But we're talking about phosphorus and potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and even in some regards sodium. So now what we're down to, and a lot of people spend a lot of time on micronutrients, but understand they call those primary and secondary nutrients for a reason, because their volumes need to be correct. Yeah, we can see some deficiencies show up because of lack of micronutrients, but if you don't take care of the basics, the things that are most important on that plate that I talked about, in other words, I'd like to add a little bit of salt to the steak, but if the steak's no good, that salt doesn't make a heck of a lot of difference. So what we want to do is we want to get the steak right, which is one of those major nutrients, and then we can spice it up a little bit with something that we can put on it in the form of salt or pepper or whatever. And that's kind of, if you look at it that way, that's kind of where your micronutrients fall.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the micronutrient boron and what he looks for as in being too much boron and not enough boron, and how boron can get into your soil.
And so when I'm looking at micronutrients, and I kind of go down through a series of them, and one of the first ones I look at, which is a nutrient that's not needed in great volumes, but is very necessary for most crops, and that's boron. One of the problems with boron is it's not a problem as such, but it is what happens to boron. With lots of water movement, boron, because it's neither positively nor negatively charged, also is one of those nutrients that likes to leach and moves through the soil profile. So with that in mind, you're going to have a lot of times where if you've had heavy rainfall or you were using a lot of irrigation and you're pushing a lot of water through there and you get to the end of the year, you can find yourself boron deficient fairly easily. The sandier the soil gets, the more mobile boron will become. Now, one of the things is everybody gets very nervous because it's not your classic nutrient where we can keep pouring it on, and the more and more we get, the better and better things are. What we see, of course, is when we apply boron a little at a time or several applications of small amounts, we get a nice response. Good way to look at boron, we want it at least 1 part per million. Some of the books will tell you 0.8% or 0.8 parts per million up to 2 parts per million. Once you begin to get above 2 parts per million, then you can view some toxicity, which can be very damaging because they can blank out blossoms on your tree. They can also burn leaves. They can have some really toxic effects. So it's a little good keeping it above at least 0.8 parts per million, but really don't push it up above 2 parts per million. And one of the things that you look at is calcium controls boron. And it's very necessary that you have good calcium levels, at least above 60, but really where you'd really like to have it's between 65 to 70 on our calcium base saturation percent, which then should give you enough pounds to basically control the toxic effects of boron. The less calcium you have in your soil, the more toxic boron can become. We look at a lot of soils I've dealt with in California where their annual irrigation, the amounts of boron that they apply through their irrigation, can be anywhere from 6 to 10 pounds of boron, which, and I'll explain something right now. It's a really simple thing to think about. The aerobic zone, which is what we test in our soil tests, and the number that we really want to look at is that top 6 3/4 inches, or in some cases a little bit less because of the compaction, but the depth that air can get to. Well, if you take that out, pile it up, weigh every bit of it down to that aerobic zone size, that 6 3/4 inches, it's going to weigh approximately 2 million pounds. So if you think of boron at 1 part per million, I want you to think of this as take that 2 million pounds and divide it into a block of 1 million pounds and a block of another 1 million pounds. Okay, there's 2 separate blocks here now. And if I have a pound in that top one and a pound in the bottom one, basically I have 1 part per million. 1 part, which is 1 pound, in a million pounds, which is the definition of a part per million. So at 1 pound in that top million and 1 pound, so the total that you would find in that soil would be 1 part per million, but there essentially is 2 parts of boron, or 2 pounds, in the top aerobic zone. But when you look at parts per million, now you're dividing it. So a lot of people get confused that they say, well, if I want, 1 pound and 1 million pounds, I'll put a pound on the top. It doesn't work that way. You want a pound in both of those blocks of million that you break up your soil into. So when you look at that, you say, well, how much does that mean? Well, if I only want to go up to 2, that means I only want to apply another pound to the top and another pound to the bottom for a total of 4 total pounds, 2 in the top, 2 in the bottom, for 2 parts per million. It's a really kind of unique way to look at it. It's one way to know what you really have, and then you can say I have too much or I don't have enough, and then I don't have good calcium numbers, so I certainly don't want to exceed that. In fact, you may even see problems at the very top end of that. So then, after we have our boron, and we'll talk about each and every nutrient and what its function is, and we may pair a couple together from time to time, but we're going to talk at each and every one and where we want it to be and why we need it at that level and what that nutrient will do for the plant or crop you're trying to grow.
Now Bill's moving on from boron to iron.
So once we have boron, we move on next to iron. Now iron we'd like to have, and this gives you an idea just how much more iron we can have in that soil than boron. We wanted like 200 to 300 parts per million. So that's a lot higher. One of the good things about iron, which I've looked a lot and never seen it be a problem, is to see iron too high. I've seen it at 1,000 parts per million. I've seen it even higher than that, and it doesn't seem to create any problem for that particular crop. It'll just have plenty that it can work on, and you probably won't ever have to add any iron to that soil. But one of the things that's unique to iron is that the plant can pick it up, one of the few that it can pick up at all from deeper levels outside of that aerobic zone. So I've seen many crops that may show a very small amount of iron, and that iron still has plenty in my tissues. The plants are dark green, so it's getting enough. And one of the ways it gets it is in the deeper locations, it can acidulate, or basically have acid detergent from the roots and can actually dissolve iron from lower depths and get it into the plant. How do you know that's going to happen? Really, the only way I've ever known how to do this is, it's not really scientific, but I look at the plant that's growing. I know through my soil test that I am very, very low of iron on that surface, and the plant is plenty green, my tissues say there's plenty of iron, then I pretty much know we're getting enough from below. Why is that important? Well, why would we spend a lot of money to build up iron to a higher level when we can basically acidulate out iron from these lower depths? And we keep an eye on that. We continue to monitor our soil samples, and if we see it start to get too low, or we start to see some iron numbers starting to recede, then we know we probably are going to have to add some iron to that particular soil.
Next up on the list to explain is manganese, iron's twin.
The next one is iron's twin. I call it twin because manganese and iron are kind of grouped together. And the reason I group them together, because you can create an iron deficiency from having more manganese than iron. So if your iron numbers, we'll take a number, I would take somewhere where they might fall, somewhere around 50 parts per million iron. But your manganese or 55. Even I've seen them where it's 1 pound, or 1 part per million is enough to make a difference. Where you will basically, what it does is it oxidizes or basically takes the iron that's in your leaf and oxidize it into rust, basically iron oxide. And because of that, you will take that leaf off, send it to the lab, and it won't expose that you have an iron deficiency or a manganese toxicity, but it'll just say you have plenty of each. And so you can't figure out why it won't do that. And what it really needs is another application, surface application on the soil of iron. Iron sulfate is usually the best thing to use. And so what we have there, you have one of the micronutrients affecting the other one. And as we go down here, manganese depends on your soil test. This is probably one of the biggest, I don't want to say disparities, but where the numbers can be anywhere from 1 part per million of manganese as being deficient to 5 parts per million being excessive, which isn't a whole lot of range, 1 to 5. Or on some scales that I like to use, you can have everywhere down from below 40 is deficient up to 200 to 250 is excessive. And again, look at what your soil tests or the lab that is doing those soil tests for you and go with the numbers that they say what is good, moderate, or excellent. And we're always trying to get to that excellent number.
Moving on from manganese, now it's copper's turn.
Next is we have copper. Okay, copper has got a lot of characteristics that are very valuable for plants, but it needs to be above 2 parts per million by the soil tests I go by, and it needs to be, for excellent results, 5 or above. And in some crops that are higher demand for copper, you would want to run that number up if it means more resiliency. But again, when we talk at each individual nutrient later on, we'll explain all the benefits and why copper becomes so important. But enough said, it's nature's natural fungicide, and that's why it's very good for healthy plants. And it also gives your plants resiliency, meaning the ability to handle stress, the ability to handle bend but not break, those kind of things. So copper becomes very important in those regards.
Last but not least, Bill's going to talk about zinc.
And then the last one for right now, I'll go just briefly to a couple of them, but this is what probably more people are familiar with when it comes to micronutrients, almost than any of the rest of those micronutrients, and that's zinc. And for years I went out and talked to a lot of clients, and I said, well, we're short of zinc, we're going to need to apply so many pounds of zinc. And most clients will say, okay, soil test says you need it, so you're going to apply it on there. But if I say you're going to need to add more copper, or you're going to need particularly going to add more manganese, they're going to go, what do I need that for? Because they're not the micronutrients that most people are familiar with. Sometimes those two particularly, and it can be boron and iron too, is what we call that hidden hunger, where I'm low, but I don't see any outward symptoms. Whereas with zinc, everybody's probably seen a zinc deficiency, where they've seen the rosetting on the growing tips where they don't want to expand tissue, or they've seen the interveinal chlorosis where you've got the dark veins and yellow between those veins. Those are the kind of things that people are used to, and so they apply it. But all of the micronutrients have their place. And one other thing about zinc, there is no magic number with zinc. What you need to make sure you do with zinc is have it in balance with phosphate, because zinc is antagonistic to phosphate. So when it gets much higher than the correct amount of phosphate you want, and it gets way higher on the zinc, you will have a hard time picking up phosphate. And conversely, if your phosphate is way, way too high, and I see this a lot in dairy soils or place where lots of manure has been applied because they've over-applied phosphate for several years and they haven't kept the zinc up with it. Now all of a sudden we're seeing zinc deficiency. In a lot of cases on numbers that aren't so low, but they're low compared to that phosphate. And so that's another one that can bite you, is that relationship between phosphorus and zinc.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the micro of micronutrients.
And finally we have molybdenum and cobalt and even nickel. I'll kind of group those all together because they are like what I call micronutrients, meaning they need very, very little of those nutrients to have enough in the soil. If you can imagine having 1 pound of anything in 2 million pounds, you would hardly notice it. However, if it's not there, you can see some things like poor assimilation of nitrogen because molybdenum's not there. Several, particularly livestock issues with a lack of cobalt. And nickel we're still finding some new types of deficiencies that can show up from a lack of nickel. So those are all down. Probably 1 part per million is more than enough. And I've seen things be satisfied down at somewhere around as low as 0.8. So it doesn't need very much for it to be adequate and give it all that it really needs. The one other thing I'd like to also bring up, and it's a nutrient that most people don't check for, and that's chlorides. But when we talk about water down the road, you're going to find that you're probably going to want to add chlorides to your testing. And one of the reasons why is it is an essential nutrient for plants to grow. And in addition to that, it can be too high just from the volume of water we put in there. Now, the good thing is it is also an anion, and if you look back at all those micronutrients I was talking about, particularly iron, manganese, copper, and zinc, they're very, very strong cations that are held tightly, so we don't lose a lot of those. But with chloride, it's an anion. That's why it likes to pair up with sodium, but with good soil structure and also good quality water pouring through, chloride won't be an issue for you because it'll be leachable and it'll move out of that soil profile. So now this is the beginning of what I want to look at as looking at a soil test. And then down the road, as you start to get soil tests, you'll begin to probably have some questions or comments. And I love to have you comment or ask questions on that. And depending on the volume and how soon we receive enough questions, we'll have a whole episode of, in a nutshell, dedicated to our mailbag, which is your questions on all of these different topics that I might want to talk at. I think it'll be really a good learning tool. It may be you're thinking it and somebody else asks it, and we both will all learn something from that. Somebody's idea or someone's question brought several things to mind that made things much clearer for you. So for today, that's your soil test in a nutshell. And I look forward to seeing you soon on our next podcast.
Thank you very much again, Bill. And like he said, we do intend on having some mailbag questions to be answered. So if you guys have any questions at all, please be sure to leave a comment down below and we'll see if we can get to answering some of them. That is all we have for this part 2 of breaking down soil tests. I hope you all enjoyed, and make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.